Dean David, Professor Tom, ladies and gentlemen, Kevin, who's very well known in Ireland from his work there, and indeed still writes for my own newspaper, I'm very glad to say, particularly when it comes to coverage of Northern Ireland or when it comes to coverage on Irish affairs in America, and of course for his work on exposing cardinal law, he and that wonderful team who deservedly won the Pulitzer Prize. And his book, I am saying not because it's he's been so kind to me, but it is the case. It's on my desk and has been since it was published in 2003, I think. Yep. And Jim Smith, thank you, Jim, for bringing me here. I heard Jim speak in Lemoyne yesterday, but I'm familiar with Jim's work on the Magdalens anyhow. We've had a lot of connections over the years, through email preferably. He spoke very comprehensively and very passionately about this subject, which he, I have to say, is the main driver behind and has been for very, very many years. Both he and I are optimistic that his work will bear quite considerable fruition under this new government, because a lot of the current new ministers would have been very sympathetic to the case presented on behalf of the Magdalens by Jem and others in the Justice for Magdalens grouping. I'm here to talk about a very difficult subject for an Irishman. I'm here to talk about the prevalence of clerical child sex abuse among Irish men. And it's a topic I've written about before in the past, and there's a bit of background. How this arose is there's an international magazine called The Tablet, published in the UK. It's a Catholic magazine. And they commissioned me to write an article, and this is very much between ourselves, in 2002 on the clerical child sex abuse crisis. And I decided to address this element, this factor, this Irish issue where that was concerned. And I won't go into details here because I will later. And the then editor, when I sent the article to him, came back to me in quite a state saying he couldn't publish it, that they had spent decades trying to get themselves removed from a perception that they were anti-Irish, and that if they published my article, it would undo all that work overnight. So I decided to approach our own features editor at the time, and I said, would you publish this? And they did, and to be frank, I thought the sky would fall. I thought the usual suspects would be jumping up and down demanding our blood and mine yet again. But it didn't happen, because there's more than a grain of truth, I feel, in what it says. It was January the 15th, 2010, and Ireland's President, Mrs. Mary McAleese, was speaking at her residence, Áras in Uachtaráin, to members of the Diplomatic Corps at the annual presentation of New Year greetings there. Traditionally, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps in Ireland has been the Papal Nuncio, currently Archbishop Giuseppe Leanza, and he conveyed sincerest greetings to the President in a brief address on behalf of his fellow diplomats. Somewhat uncharacteristically, and I know this woman quite well, our President delivered what could be construed as a terse response. She said that the problems addressed by the Ryan and Murphy reports, and I'll explain what these are later, both were published in 2009, and therefore, since she had previously met the Diplomatic Corps, she said, as well as the vulnerability of children to abuse in the home, the abuse of children were peculiar neither to Ireland nor to the Catholic Church. These were global problems, she said. Quotes, and to assume otherwise is to offer abusers the same dishonourable secret veil which gave them protection and immunity for far too long. End of quote. She continued, I hope the world's children will benefit from the greater scepticism and vigilance that our experience rightly demands in order to better protect our children. She had a reason for saying this. What gave her comments added piquancy was a remark made by Cardinal Claudio Humes, prefect of the Congregation for Clergy in the Vatican, just 2 days previously on January the 13th, 2010. Commenting in the Vatican daily L'Osservatore Romano, he said, it will be wrong to make generalizations as a result of the Irish clerical abuse experience. The clerical sex abuse scandals in Ireland were not representative of the behaviour of the vast majority of priests in the Catholic Church, he said. He was asked then if events in certain parts of the world did not suggest that something had gone wrong in relations between the bishops and their priests. And then, in a phrase which enraged many people in Ireland, he continued, quotes, the painful Irish happenings, which, by the way, have seen some bishops assume their responsibilities and resign, simply do not relate to the entire episcopal ministry. The bishops are good fathers for their priests, he said. He continued, certainly there are some unbecoming situations, but they're very limited in number. Unfortunately, we are talking about situations linked to the human condition, and that's what happened in Ireland, he said. Asked then if, in his view, the credibility of priests worldwide had been undermined by such scandals as those in Ireland, he continued, unfortunately, and this is, anyhow, you get it, unfortunately, in a society which has little inclination to dig deep in its search for truth, such scandals damage the image of the priest. Above all, because the media concentrate on these events rather than on all the good that is done by the vast majority of priests. This is why we have this perception. I mean, it's a particular line that the Vatican tends to adopt quite frequently. Blame the media. I'm not saying the media are above complaint or above criticism, but it doesn't answer the fundamental issue. Cardinal Hummes is no ordinary curial cardinal. He was appointed prefect of the Congregation for the Clergy by Pope Benedict in 2006. He's a Franciscan who himself was considered a strong candidate for Pope at the 2005 conclave, which eventually elected Benedict. And forgive me, but I thought he was going to be Pope, and I actually forecasted in one of my own writings, mea culpa. His comments about Irish happenings provoked outrage in Ireland, then still reeling from the findings of the Murphy report just a couple of months beforehand. And it established in unequivocal terms that the church authorities in Dublin had systematically covered up clerical child sex abuse to protect the institution from scandal and to protect its assets and to protect, in the words of the report, its most important people, the priests. In fact, it went on to say that the welfare of children wasn't even a factor in the earlier period of the 30 years investigated. 7 months previous to the publication of Murphy in May 2009, the Ryan Report found that children in residential institutions run by 18 religious congregations had been sexually, physically and emotionally abused, as well as neglected on matters of food and clothing over most of the decades of the 20th century, but in particular between the 1930s and the 1970s. Contributing to President McAleese's comparatively testy mood as she greeted members of the diplomatic corps that January morning in 2010 were revelations in the Murphy report that when the Murphy Commission wrote to the Vatican as part of its investigation and to the papal nuncio in Ireland requesting cooperation in its inquiries, that correspondence was completely ignored. Twice in the case of the papal nunciature in Ireland, they didn't have the courtesy to respond to a statutory commission of the Irish state. There was a feeble explanation afterwards from Rome saying that, oh, we are a separate state, this inquiry didn't come through the usual diplomatic channels, as it should have. But Murphy apparently was of the view she couldn't use such channels, such state channels, because she was investigating the state as well as the church. But had the will been there, we all know Rome could have cooperated. That morning, President McAleese spoke to the diplomats of, quotes, the utter vulnerability of children in the absence of stringent vigilance and accountability of those charged with their care. Irish state authorities and Catholic Church authorities were found seriously wanting, and innocent children were hurt as a consequence, she said. She continued, thanks to the victims and their advocates, we've been able to offer redress and reassurance that child protection is a high priority, infinitely more important than the status of any institution or individual, and that child abuse is, as it has always been, a heinous crime. But today it is a crime which will be pursued, not suppressed. These matters rightly absorb us in Ireland, she said. Adding to Irish anger at Cardinal Hummes as a painful Irish happenings comment, as though the phenomenon were peculiar to Ireland, was the knowledge in Ireland that his very own congregation, the Congregation for Clergy, played a very significant role in frustrating the Irish Catholic Church in its attempts to deal effectively with the problem. The Congregation for Clergy, for instance, refused to give recognition to child protection guidelines introduced by the Irish bishops in their 1996 framework document, and again in their updated 2005 Our Children, Our Church document. It meant, in practice, those guidelines were only guidelines, as famously said by the then Archbishop of Dublin and later Cardinal Desmond Connell in an exchange with abuse victim Mary Collins. He said that in December 1996, just months after those guidelines had been introduced in January of 1996. He said they did not have to be followed and were not binding in canon law. He himself was then a member of the Congregation for Clergy. This lack of recognition by Rome meant that an accused priest could appeal to Rome over his bishop's head if action was taken against him by the local church on foot of allegations of child abuse, and that most likely the priest would win, as he would have the backing of Rome over his bishop. And that happened in Ireland. As Cardinal Connell himself was acutely aware, there was a precedent for this particular Irish happening in the early 1990s. Following one of the first of these canonical trials anywhere in the world, to his credit, Cardinal Connell actually set up two. One of the priests was laicized. The second guy, Tony Walsh, was also laicized. He'd been abusing kids since 1978. It was decided in Dublin by this body set up to investigate him that he should be laicized. He appealed to Rome. Rome overturned the decision and decided that he should spend 10 years in a monastery instead, that he should not be laicized. In the intervening period between his appeal to Rome and Rome making a decision, he abused a child and he went to jail as a result of that abuse. And then Cardinal Connell went to Rome, and as a result of that, he was then eventually laicized by Rome. Walsh, I should say, was again jailed for 16 years last December in one of the most shocking abuse trials we've had in Ireland, in connection with three young men as they are now. There were three boys at the time, and one of those cases was particularly awful. In fact, he got 123 years altogether. He was sentenced on various charges if you add the accumulated charges, but he'll serve 16 because that was the longest single sentence he was given. Despite this case, Tony Walsh's case, Rome still refused to give the Irish bishops Our Children, Our Church document, their updated guidelines, the Recognitio as it's called, which would give it authority in canon law. As the Murphy Report put it, the 1996 framework document was not a norm and therefore was not binding on individual bishops. The Holy See did not formally recognise it either. Victims have expressed their disappointment about this. The Murphy Report continued and pointed out that the follow-up document of 2005 didn't receive recognition either. Murphy went on, this is in direct contrast to the approach adopted by the American bishops. Discrimination in favour of America by the Vatican. The Holy See recognised the norms proposed by the American Conference of Bishops in 2002 and again in 2006. And the reason Murphy puts for this, the Murphy Commission, is that the American bishops couldn't agree among themselves on it, so Rome decided to make a decision. And so therefore Rome made them binding in the United States in canon law, which they wouldn't do in Ireland, in support of the Irish bishops. The Murphy Report said that the Irish bishops wanted procedures that they could be certain of. They felt extremely vulnerable because in 1996 they were meeting an onslaught of complaints and Rome was pulling any particular solid ground that they had from under them. The former Chancellor of the Dublin Archdiocese, Monsignor Alex Stenson, told the Murphy Commission that Rome had reservation about the framework document's policy of reporting to the civil authorities, and that's the kernel of Rome's problem. The basis of the reservation was that the making of a report put the reputation and good name of a priest at risk. There was no concern that this guy might abuse again. There was no concern about the children he had abused before or the children that he might abuse in the future. It continued, the Murphy Report that is, it is therefore very clear that Rome itself has profound questions to answer concerning, that's my conclusion, it's therefore very clear that Rome itself has profound questions to answer concerning these so-called painful Irish happenings. This has been underlined since, again, as recently as January of this year, when it emerged that a 1997 Vatican directive to every single bishop in Ireland rejected a recommendation by the Irish Catholic Church that priests who abuse children should be reported to the police. In that letter sent by the Vatican, as I said, to each Irish bishop and marked strictly confidential, it said it would support the appeal, and we know in practice this is what happened, it would support the appeal of any priest defrocked by the Irish Church in connection with child sex abuse. It did so in a number of cases like that, including Tony Walsh, as I said earlier. That Vatican letter expressed serious reservations of a canonical and moral nature about the mandatory reporting of such crimes to the civil authorities. On the RTE documentary Unspeakable Crimes last January, which exposed this, an unidentified Irish bishop confirmed that at the time in 1997 he made a note describing this Vatican letter, and this is very interesting. He described that Vatican letter as a mandate to conceal the crimes of priests. That's written by an Irish bishop, contemporaneous to that letter. At a 1999, 2 years later, meeting in Rome, the Irish bishops were reminded collectively by a top Vatican official that they were, quotes, bishops first, not policemen. The programme also reported that in a 1998 meeting with Cardinal Hoyas, who had been prefect of the Congregation of Clergy from 1996 to 2006, Archbishop Desmond Connell thumped a table in frustration as Cardinal Hoyes insisted it was Vatican policy to defend the rights of a priest above all. Last December, the current Archbishop of Dublin, Jeremy Martin, told the Irish Times that in the past, where the abuse victim was concerned, quotes, most of the Irish bishops felt that dealing with the Congregation for Clergy in Rome was disastrous. Then this was the same Cardinal Hoyes who in September 2001 wrote a letter to a French bishop, Pierre Piquin, congratulating him for not reporting an abuser priest to the police. Earlier that year, Bishop Piquin received a suspended 3-month sentence for not reporting serial abuser Father René Bisset. That priest was eventually given an 18-year prison sentence for child sex abuse crimes between 1989 and 1996. You can see, and it is my view, the Vatican has extraordinarily serious questions to answer, certainly as regards this issue where Ireland is concerned, but even more broadly than Ireland. So when Cardinal Hoyes' successor, Cardinal Claudia Hummes, seemed to refer in January of last year to the clerical child sex abuse problem in the Catholic Church as the painful Irish happenings, it was hardly surprising that it stung Irish sensibilities as it did. You can therefore imagine the understandable satisfaction in Ireland then as 2010 progressed and stories of clerical child sex abuse began to emerge in Germany, Italy, Belgium and other European countries. It seemed these painful Irish happenings were becoming very European indeed. Then Cardinal Hoyes and the Vatican had for many years been suggesting that the abuse problem was one for the English-speaking or Anglophone world. The inference being that this was rooted in hostility to the Catholic Church in that predominantly Protestant part of the globe, not least on the part of the Anglophone media, which of course would include such disreputable newspapers as the Boston Globe. In October 2001, Cardinal Hoyes said as much, not about the Boston Globe, but about the Western media. By then, and according to information collated from media around the world by Catholics for a Free Choice, the American group, over 5,000 cases of clerical child sex abuse involving Catholic clergy and religious have been reported in the previous 6 years, that's since 1995, and included were at least 20 countries, just 8 of which were English-speaking. But where that painful Irish happenings comment was concerned, Rome appeared to have changed its mind just a month later, by February of last year, 2010. Maybe this was because of President Mary McAleese's tart comment at that meeting with the Irish Diplomatic Corps the previous January, or because of the furore in Ireland, or because of both. But in mid-December 2010, all of Ireland's Catholic bishops were summoned to Rome and met the Pope and the curial cardinals in Rome at a meeting arranged following publication of the Murphy Report. At a press conference afterwards in Rome on February the 16th, 2010, Ireland's Catholic Primate, Cardinal Sean Brady, said that Pope Benedict, quotes, recognises that clerical child sex abuse is not an Irish problem, it is not an Anglophone problem, it is not a Catholic Church problem. The Pope recognised instead that it was a problem with the universal provenance, he said. And yet, there is no getting away from the fact that in that Anglophone world, the names of Irish clergy have been very, very prominent among clerical child sex abusers. You must have noticed yourselves all those Irish names wherever such abuse is spoken of and wherever Green was born. It is very, very striking. For instance, in Australia, and these are only samples, we've had Butler, Claffey, Cleary, Coffey, Connolly, Cox, Farrell, Fitzmaurice, Flynn, Gannon, Jordan, Keating, McGrath, McNamara, Murphy, Nestor, O'Brien, O'Donnell, O'Regan, O'Rourke, Riley, Ryan, Shea, Sullivan, Sweeney, Taylor, Tracy. That's the Pope. I told him not to contact me during this talk. That's just Australia. In Canada, Brown, Corrigan, Hickey, Kelly, O'Connor, Kenny, Marr. Here in Boston, Father John Gagan, the most accused child sex abuse priest in American history. Elsewhere in the US, Birmingham, Brown, Brett, Conway, Dunn, Hughes, Lenihan, McEnany, O'Connor, O'Grady, O'Shea, Riley, Ryan, Shanley. In the UK, Dooley, Flahive, Jordan, Murphy, O'Brien, and then in Ireland, all those Irish names. Now it is very clear in one sense why so many clerical child sex abusers in the English-speaking world had Irish names. Ireland was far and away the main supplier of Catholic priests in that English-speaking world, either directly or through its diaspora. Ireland was by far the predominantly Catholic country in that Anglophone world. But that does not really or fully explain the extent of Irish names among such abusers in the English-speaking world, particularly when you take into account the situation here in the US, for example, where fewer Italian or Spanish names appear among such clerical abusers, despite the ample presence among American Catholic priests of those with Italian and Spanish names. It is difficult not to ask whether there is something uniquely Irish about this awful problem. Did Cardinal Hummes have a point in his painful Irish happenings comment? Is this clerical child sex abuse tragedy something of an Irish disease? To add further evidence to that suggestion, there are all those priest abusers in Ireland itself, as I referred to earlier on, but more particularly, there were 25 investigated by the Ferns inquiry. In Dublin, a sample of 46 out of 102 were investigated by the Murphy Commission. In Cloyne, 19 priests have been investigated by the Cloyne inquiry there, and its report is to be published next month. And those 19 men abused children since 1996. It's not historic. Then there are all those priests, brothers and nuns investigated by the Ryan Commission, these are the people who are running residential institutions such as orphanages, reformatories and industrial schools for children. And none of this takes into account all those priests convicted in the Irish courts. In a survey of Ireland's Catholic dioceses following publication of the Ferns report in October 2005, my own newspaper established that approximately 260 priests across the country, across the island, had by then been accused of child sex abuse, and those figures came from the dioceses themselves, the 26 Catholic dioceses in the Republic, in all of Ireland. Last May, the Church's very own child abuse watchdog, the National Board for Safeguarding Children, disclosed in the previous year alone, since April 2009, there had been 197 new allegations of clerical child sex abuse reported to it. I should point out that it is possible that more than one of those allegations could have been involved the same priest. And in Ireland, and this is also significant, the problem is not just within the cloth. Research indicates that it extends to other Irish Catholic males. On Friday, April the 19th, 2001, a report commissioned by the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre was published. Entitled Sexual Abuse and Violence in Ireland, or known in sense as the Savvy Report, it was carried out by the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin and involved telephone interviews with more than 3,000 randomly invited adults, 71% of whom agreed to take part. They defined sexual abuse as being either of the contact or non-contact variety, the latter being where a person was forced to look at pornography or watch sexual acts. That's the non-contact variety. The survey found that 30% of Irish women interviewed and 24% of Irish men had been sexually abused as children. In the rest of Europe, the figures for child sex abuse are 17% for women and 5% for men. That's in Ireland, 30% for women, 24% for men. In Europe, 17% for women, 5% for men. In the US, 29% for women, 7% for men. You can see the huge disparity there. Nearly half of those abused, that's 47%, in Ireland said they had never disclosed it to anyone before, while just 7.8% of the women and 1% of the men had reported it to the police. Commenting on these findings, the man who launched the report, Professor David Finkelher, director of the Crimes Against Children Research Centre at the University of New Hampshire here in the US, remarked that Ireland has, quotes, a more serious problem, quotes, with child sexual abuse than either the rest of Europe or North America. He found the figures for abuse of boys and men to be particularly stark. Quotes, the rates for men are 3.5 times higher here in Ireland than in North America, where the rates are relatively high. End of quotes, he said. Among factors he suggested as a possible explanation for this Irish phenomenon was alcohol misuse, gender segregation in schools, social isolation, and an excess of men without a sexual partner in their immediate area. These findings and experience in the English-speaking Catholic world generally begs the question, what is wrong with the Irish male? And why, particularly among Irish clerical sex abusers, have the great majority of victims also been male? All indications, not least evidence from still living victims, suggests that this is not an overnight phenomenon. If it is not an Irish disease, it is certainly an Irish problem. So why would this be so? And this is where I get into the area of conjecture. There are probable historic reasons. From what we know, up to 1845, the Irish people had a fairly relaxed view to sex and issues of sexuality. With an abundance of cheap food, the population grew and grew, as small amounts of ground, fertile ground, produced very large supplies of the potato. In 1841, Ireland's population was 8.1 million people. In the intervening 120 years to 1961, that population almost halved to 4.2 million. The immediate cause of this catastrophic decline, of course, was the Great Famine, which began in 1845. But an immediate effect of that famine in Ireland was an end to the subdivision of land holdings and diversification away from the potato to other crops and to cattle. It meant the end to subdivision of holdings, and less land was available to a smaller number of people. This wrench in land use had a defining effect on Irish sexuality and on the Irish family. An economic imperative dictated sexual restraint, as, regardless of family size, just one son would inherit. He too would not marry until late in life, and generally when his parents had died. Others in the family emigrated, and some, usually encouraged by a devout mother, entered the church. This pattern persisted into the late 1960s. Sex became taboo, allied to Victorian prudery in the late 19th century, and a Catholic Church seemingly fixated on sex as the only sin. Sensuality was pushed under in Irish consciousness. A celibate elite became the noblest caste. These clergy had unparalleled power and influence through their close identification with moderate Irish nationalism, the fact that they were educated when so many others were not, and the control they exerted over what there was of an education system and of a healthcare service. Parallel with post-famine Ireland, Rome was experiencing one of its most dogmatic and longest of papacies under Pope Pius IX, the longest-serving pope. Traditionally, it's believed that the longest-serving pope was Pope Peter, the first pope. So he's always described as the second longest-serving pope. But by record, he was there for 32 years. So Pius IX, or Pio IX, was the longest-serving pope from 1846 until 1878, I think it was it? My maths were never great. 32 and 46, anyway, 1878. This papacy, under Pius IX, and I was talking to Kevin earlier on, not this Kevin, he was elected in 1848, and he came into the papacy as a very liberal pope in terms of doctrine and his attitude to doctrine. And in the revolutions of 1848, which swept Europe, including Ireland, he was driven out of Rome. And he came back a number of years later, a complete raving conservative, desperately attached to orthodoxy, in a historical pattern not dissimilar to what happened Benedict. Cardinal Ratzinger in Vatican II was a very liberal young theologian, but in the wave of rebellions, or whatever you want to call them, of 1968, his own lecture hall was taken over into Bingen, and the man, literally almost overnight, went from being a great liberal to becoming a very, very conservative man, devoted to order above all else. This is what happened Pio IX or Pius IX, and added to his conservatism was the fact that with the reunification of Italy, he lost all the papal states, his temporal power was gone, and he set about creating, if you like, a spiritual empire, quite a dogmatic one. And his papacy consolidated the power of Rome in Ireland and elsewhere in the Catholic world. But it was particularly significant in Ireland because after Catholic emancipation in 1831, after the famine, the Catholic Church began to find its feet again after the penal laws. Rome rule asserted itself in Ireland under the doughty figure of such as Cardinal Paul Cullen of Dublin, the first Irish cardinal, personal friend of Pius IX. Paul Cullen had been rector of the Irish College in Rome, and in that period became very close to the new pope, and that continued thereafter. And I hasten to add, and I certainly hope it's the case, that he's no relation to Kevin Collins. He received the red hat from Pope Pius IX in 1866. Such men as Paul Cullen oversaw the rise of Irish Catholicism from persecution and poverty into a very powerful force. Crucially, they also built a solid Irish Catholic middle class, which was intended to act as a bulwark for the Church against any possible future persecution. Pius IX, I would argue, was the most influential pope in modern Irish history. He shaped the traditional Irish Catholicism that dominated at home and abroad into the latter part of the century just past, the 20th century, or as it has been described, the long 19th century of the Catholic Church in Ireland. As well as preaching absolute loyalty to Rome, the Vatican's celibate foot soldiers in Ireland preached chastity as the greatest virtue. So doing, they were heavily influenced by Jansenism, a theology which was so dominant in Ireland's seminaries from the late 18th century. Maynooth was set up in 1795, and these Jansenist theologians came over from seminaries in Europe, and they had this very strong theological outlook based on the teachings of St. Augustine, which saw the human body essentially as a manifestation of man's inferior animal nature, which must be repressed and controlled at all times, as it represented an ever-present danger to the salvation of one's soul. Irish women were expected to emulate the Virgin Mary, with a regrettable acceptance that it was not possible for them to conceive immaculately as Mary had done, and as it promulgated by Pius IX's doctrine of the Immaculate Conception in 1854. The clergy preached that celibate life was superior to married life, that impure thought or sexual thought was evil, as was all sexual activity outside of marriage and even inside of marriage when the intent was other than procreative. Jansenism was seemingly obsessed with the great stain of original sin on a fallen, never-to-be-trusted human nature. Jansenism was a dark, essentially pessimistic theology. Under its terms, sexual pleasure was taboo. It was dirty, disgusting, deeply convincing evidence of our lower nature, and which so constantly threatened the divine in the human. It saw sex as a necessary evil, there only to ensure continuation of the species. The sermons of Irish Catholic clergy for most of the 120 years between 1850 and 1970 seemed dominated by sex. This railing, allied to economic factors, had inevitable consequences in Ireland. Poverty and chastity saw to it that the marriage rate in Ireland plummeted. In 1926, there were 230,525 marriages in the predominantly new Irish Free State, now known as the Republic. By 1961, that rate was down to a third, or 76,669. The rate of illegitimate births during the 1950s in Ireland was 1.8%. The bachelor became as integral a part of Irish life as the husband. So too did the spinster with her penchant for overwrought piety. The Irish mother was totally dependent on her husband economically, a situation reinforced by the priest in the confession box. It ensured an appalling time for many Irish women, as the absolute power of the husband was abused absolutely in many homes. It drove many an Irish mother to seek solace in religion, which gave her suffering and meaning in martyrdom for a higher purpose. Nothing could bring as much consolation and pride to the devout Irish Catholic mother, whether in Ireland or here or Australia or New Zealand or Canada or wherever, as seeing her son with a Roman collar around his neck. It was said of Ireland's seminaries during the middle decades of the last century that they were full of young men whose mothers had vocations to the priesthood. It helped too that becoming a priest brought with it education, power and great status to the family. Meanwhile, as Ireland's seminaries bulged, in 1954 a book, The Vanishing Irish, was published in London questioning Ireland's dramatic depopulation, but without suggesting why. In that same decade of the 1950s, the number, meanwhile, parallel with all of this, the number of Irish Catholic clergy reached its highest level ever in Ireland. In 1956, there were 5,489 priests in Ireland, that's diocesan and including members of religious congregations. In other words, one priest for every 593 Irish Catholics, one almost per 600 Catholics. There were also 18,300 nuns and Christian brothers. Vocations were so great that between a third and a half of Irish clergy went on the missions. They had nothing for them to do at home. The Vatican was suitably impressed. That great Pope, that wonderful man, in other ways anyway, Pope John the 23rd in 1961 said, "Any Christian country will produce a greater or lesser number of priests, but Ireland, that beloved country, is the most fruitful of mothers in this respect." Only recently have we become familiar with the darker side of that rosy picture. Almost 15,000 survivors of institutions run by religious during the same middle decades of the last century have been in contact with the government-established Residential Institutions Redress Board. There were tens of thousands more, of course, but the vast majority of those have died. They have received an average of approximately $88,000 each in compensation for being in those institutions, which the Ryan report found had physically and emotionally abused them as children, who were also neglecting their welfare. In boys' institutions, as I said already, there was also sexual abuse, which the Ryan report found was endemic in those institutions. In total, compensation for such people is currently running at the equivalent of $1.8 billion, where the Irish state is concerned. The Irish state, had legal responsibility for the institutions, but they were managed by 18 religious congregations. This was 1930s to 1970s Ireland, when it was also producing so many clergy, as I said, that between a third and a half had to go on the missions. Meanwhile, as indicated already, more and more victims of clerical child sex abuse by diocesan priests are coming forward, while more and more cases of child sex abuse in the family are coming before the courts. What is emerging is evidence that despite massive repression, Irish male sexuality was simply redirected into areas where its expression was least likely to be found out. For many Irish men, it seems the combined weight of mother and church ensured that women were out of bounds, and the risks were too great for both parties if a woman became pregnant. With children, sadly, there was no risk. I don't mean that in that way. There was no risk of pregnancy. There was even less risk that they would talk, even in the home. Such was the standing of the clergy. And if those abused children did talk, they were generally not believed and punished further. That has been the story again and again in such cases down the years. And if I might illustrate that, in that case recently about Tony Walsh, when he got 16 years further, one of those three lads he abused at that time, he was a young guy, about 8 years of age. He told his mother at the time, back in the early 1980s. His mother clattered him around the house. This is evidence in the court. I covered the case myself. She clattered him around the house, that poor woman. Couldn't believe that he would say such a thing about a priest. And she sent him back to the priest. And he was afraid of what would happen to him, so he got a friend to come back with him. And Tony Walsh opened the parochial house door and brought in the young lad, left his friend outside, and abused him again and sent him home to a mother who wouldn't believe him. So he didn't talk about it again. In fact, he just told his own adult children about 2 weeks before the trial began, and they were, two of them, one accepted it, the other guy has still not dealt with it. Children were accessible to clergy in particular. Some clergy clearly were tempted. With boys, where such clergy were concerned, it was even easier. No one suspected anything untoward in seeing a priest with a boy or a brother with a boy. And in single-sex institutions, schools for example, boys were readily accessible. There can be no doubt that this single-sex situation played a huge part in the sexual abuse of boys by Christian brothers in Ireland, in Canada and in Australia. Most of those brothers themselves would have joined the congregations when they were as young as 12 and 13. Their sexuality would have been formed almost entirely in an all-male environment and most probably never developed beyond a very early, immature stage. And there is the matter of celibacy, mandatory celibacy. In itself, it may not be a cause of the present crisis in the Catholic Church, but the very culture of enforced celibacy has created a context which could be said to be a perfect haven for paedophiles. It provided a cover of unchallenged respectability and authority with easy access to children. That guy, Tony Walsh, used to walk into the Christian Brothers School in Ballyfermot. He'd pick a kid out. Nobody asked the question. The brother wouldn't query it. Nothing. The brother didn't suspect anything. He had 60 altar boys in his team, the largest number of altar boys in any parish in Ireland. So they had that sort of authority. An expert group employed by the Ferns inquiry, as its 2005 report said, quotes, was unanimous in its view that the vow of celibacy contributed to the problem of sexual abuse in the church, unquote. It is something the church, and particularly clergy, still find very, very hard to accept. In Ireland, it seems, we've only begun in recent decades, with increased prosperity and education, to adopt a more normal approach to sexuality. You might say this began with the Whittaker-Lamass first programmes for economic expansion as far back as 1958, which opened up the Republic to the world. Our population began to grow again as our prosperity increased. Sex re-emerged with television, particularly. RTE came on air in 1961, and a famous politician at the time said there was no sex in Ireland before television, Oliver J. Flanagan. The introduction of free education in 1967 allowed greater access to second and third level for many, many more young people, bringing with it an increased social confidence. People like me, people like Jim, probably would never have had any more than secondary education before, but because of the culture introduced by Donogh O'Malley when he brought in free education in 1967. And Ireland's Catholics began to assert an independence from Rome's teachings on sexuality, particularly following the publication of the Humanae Vitae encyclical in 1968, which banned all artificial means of contraception. It was widely ignored in Ireland, as in elsewhere in the Catholic world. And in fact, a pact emerged between Ireland's doctors, priests and mothers that the pill, if it was prescribed as a regulator, it wasn't central for the mother to use it. Whereas, I mean, fine, a side effect was contraception, but the doctor was prescribing it to regulate the woman's rhythm or period or whatever. And that's what happened in tens of thousands of cases. People began to breach the church's teaching on contraception, and the sky didn't fall, and they began to think about other things. So Irish people began to use their own minds on these matters, and other matters afterwards. Vocations began to decrease as the state's population grew. Last year, just 16 men began training for the priesthood in Ireland, compared to 164 in 1970. In total, there are just 72 men studying for the priesthood at Maynooth currently. It's the lowest figure since Maynooth was opened in 1795. Today, the total number of religious and secular priests, as well as brothers, adds to a little more than 7,000, while there are about 9,000 nuns, but the average age is 74. The Church itself has estimated that diocesan priest numbers will fall to between 2,000 and 2,500 in the next 10 years, and their average age is 64. As they say in your country, you do the math. They have a major personnel crisis ahead. It'll lead to, and it's already happening, increasingly involvement in the Catholic Church in Ireland. Meanwhile, and however unsatisfactorily, another indication of a more relaxed attitude to sexuality in Ireland is that births to single mothers now averages 1 in 3 in the Republic, compared to 1.8 in the 1950s. Single parenthood, which meant exile for many Irish women in the past, including my own aunt, had to exile herself. She left Ireland when she became pregnant from her fiancé. He left with her and abandoned her and came out here to go to London in the 1950s and reared her son there on her own with the assistance of a very kind English woman. But she couldn't come home. And when she did visit, on the rare occasions that she did, she had to hide her son down behind the back seat of my uncle's car in case the neighbours would be asking questions. That's what being a single mother meant in Ireland in the 1950s. Exile and humiliation and shame. What's happening in Ireland today, I mean, the single parenthood, as I said, is almost a norm, and certainly there's no taboo associated with it. But for most Catholics, this is not necessarily something to be celebrated, but we have to ask, what was it in Irish Catholicism that meant the Church prospered to such an extraordinary degree at the same time of greatest social decay in Ireland in the 1950s period? I would suggest that what occurred was rooted in a tragic confluence of Irish history and Catholic theology, particularly the Church's attitude to and teachings on sexuality as emerged from Jansenism and Jansenistic theology. That attitude and the deep desire to hold on to power, position and influence at any cost, even where children were concerned, would appear to be at the root of the child sex abuse problem in the Catholic Church in Ireland, and, as we now know, that was the case elsewhere in the Catholic world too. But in conclusion, and as a general observation about the clerical child sex abuse problem in the Catholic Church, I have to acknowledge, however painful it might be to me as an Irishman, that while it is manifest throughout this problem is manifest throughout the universal Catholic Church, this clerical child sex abuse problem does have a peculiar and significant Irish twist. It's up to historians to explore the matter more deeply and with greater authority than I do. You've been very patient, and thank you very much.